building on that last point, we are now going to talk about sufficient conditions and necessary conditions around an implication statement. Now, take P implies Q. P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent, right? So what is the relationship between them in terms of being sufficient for the other or necessitating the other, etc.? In general, we will say that P, the antecedent, is a sufficient condition for Q. On the other hand, the consequent Q is a necessary condition for P. And this one actually explains that last statement here, P only if Q. Okay, so let's think about these a little bit more. What do we mean by a sufficient condition? Now, a sufficient condition is something, let's say a condition in terms of a proposition, and it guarantees the truth of this one when it is true. Okay, so when we say P is a sufficient condition for Q, what we mean that whenever P is true, you can be sure that Q will also be true. You don't need to look at other conditions, other relationships, etc. You will know when P is true, Q is guaranteed to be true, right? And when implication is there, you can be sure of that when you look at the truth table, because you see, obviously this is out because there is no implication in this scenario. And the only condition or the only input combination where P is true is this one. And in this case, you see Q is also true. So P being true is sufficient for Q to be true. Okay, let's talk about the other one. What is a necessary condition? Now, for P to be true, when they do have this implication, meaning that when this is true, okay, Q, the consequent, is a necessary condition. Because otherwise, if Q is not satisfied, then P will not be satisfied, right? Ever. Okay. Now, when you look at this, again, forget about this one because in this scenario, there is no implication between them. But when you look at the other three combinations, you see when Q is false, P is also going to be false, right? So Q must be true for P to be true, right? You see that here. Okay, then at this point, you will ask, okay, what about this? Q is true here, but P is false. Okay, so what gives? But you see, it's a necessary condition, but may not be sufficient. That is the distinction, right? Q has to be true for P to be true, but it may not be sufficient. There might be other necessary conditions. Okay, so these are all a little bit confusing, but let's see this on an example. I think it will be much clearer. So let the proposition P denote this is a fish. So whatever this is. And Q is going to denote this swims. Okay, so this, and this are the same thing. You can put anything you like here, okay? Okay, any object, any item, anything can be put here, but you have to recognize this thing and this thing are the same. We're talking about just one single thing, okay? So when you say P implies Q, what you are saying is, if this is a fish, this swims, right? We have this implication. If this is a fish, this swims, right? So we have this implication, and applying this, we can say that being a fish, okay, that's the antecedent, it's a sufficient condition for swimming, which is the consequent, which fits to this description. Let's read this once more. Being a fish is a sufficient condition for swimming. And it makes sense, right? Because when you have this implication, this makes sense because being a fish is a sufficient condition for swimming. When you know something is a fish, you need no other information to conclude that that thing is capable of swimming, right? If you know something is a fish, you are guaranteed that it swims. You need no further information. That's what means sufficient. It's sufficient. You don't need no further information. What you know is sufficient. On the other hand, when you look at it the other way, swimming, the consequent, is a necessary condition for being a fish, right? Right? When you have to look at this necessary condition the other way. If you know something doesn't swim, right? If that is not satisfied, then you are certain it cannot be a fish. It's a necessary condition, right? You don't need to check for other conditions. If you know it doesn't swim, right, this cannot be a fish because that is necessary for it to be a fish, right? So this is what we call, or what we mean by sufficient and necessary conditions. On the other hand, we don't have the opposite relation. So swimming is not a sufficient condition for being a fish, right? The consequence is not sufficient for the antecedent. That's not the only case. There are other things that swim. You need further information to conclude something that swims is a fish, because there are other things other than fish that can swim, right? So that's not a sufficient condition. Similarly, being a fish is not a necessary condition for swimming. Again, that's for the exact same reason. There are other things that can swim apart from fish. Okay, so this is the concept of sufficient and necessary conditions.